And it's my pleasure now to introduce our two guests of honor here at the Writer's Center this evening. Ronald Collins is a retired law professor and author of 13 books on topics such as civil rights, free speech, artificial intelligence, popular culture, and noted literary figures. He is also the co-founder of the History Book Festival. Carolyn Finney is a writer, nonfiction developmental editor, and conflict mediator. She leads the Strategic Storytelling Workshop Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, is a winner of the Moth DC Stage and Moth Grand Slam finalist, and a longtime card-carrying member of the Writer's Center. Yeah. So, Ron, Carolyn, please take over. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. I just want to mention, I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland in the era when the hot shop was at the intersection of Old Georgetown Road and Wisconsin Avenue. And the Writer's Center has been foundational for me and a treasured resource. So what a privilege to be here and to be in this room also with a longtime friend, but also someone I've had great admiration for, my former much admired and much missed neighbor, Ron Collins, who lived nearby in Bethesda, Maryland. And, you know, I would see Ron and he'd be talking about this book that he just published or that book that he just published. And then there was these 3 other books that he was working on in his vast quantities of stories. And by the way, this was never, you know, this is always very low key. But I remember thinking, you know, how does he do that? And now Ron is here to talk to us about his 13th book, which he also calls his most important book.
So far.
So far. Ron, why is this book, Tragedy on Trial, the story of the infamous Emmett Till Murder Trial, your most important?
Well, thank you for that, Carolyn. And by the way, it's such a joy to be, we just did something the other night with Jamie Raskin, and Carolyn navigated that, and it was just magical. So I so enjoy working with her. And Zach, if you could hear me, I do want to thank you. He's been so supportive, and tonight we're going to be talking about, among other things, at least some of my writing process, both in this book and some others that I have coming. And you know, you mentioned 13 books, but when you got folks like David Stewart in the audience, he's a tough act to follow, and he's been very supportive. So David, so thank you very much for all the help you've done with you. You know, I didn't plan to write this book. I mean, I really didn't. Susan had arranged for us to go on a civil rights tour, and we were going through the various states in the South, and these just incredible places where so much painful history occurred. And then we got to the courtroom where the Emmett Till trial happened, and I was, you know, as a retired law professor, I was so excited. I thought, my God, this is where it happened. And the guy spoke for about 8 minutes about the trial, and then went and talked about other things. And I walked out of that, I was livid. I was just like, God, there's so much more to be said. So, I mean, literally that night I started. I mean, that night, I think it's, I just got back, I was on the internet, and I'd written about Emmett Till in the 1990s in the Baltimore Sun. I'd heard a Bob Dylan song, and it kind of inspired me. A Bob Dylan song about Emmett Till. It seems that Bob Dylan's written about everybody, the lonesome death of Haiti Carroll, and you know, all those folks. So, you know, it was the process that it began 4 years. A lot has been written about Emmett Till. There's been movies, there's been plays, there's been documentaries, and so I thought, well, what can I add? And nobody had ever written about the trial at length, and certainly nobody with a legal background had written about it. And the trial transcript had been missing for a half a century. The closing arguments had never been recorded by the court reporter. The FBI found a copy of a copy of a copy in 2000. 2004, and after all sorts of painstaking work, they were able to put the transcript together, but without the oral argument, the closing arguments. They had never been recorded. And so I was able to go to newspapers from the time, primarily African-American newspapers, and reconstruct the closing arguments, about 12 pages of them. And so I just thought, let's publish the transcript. It had never been published. But if you just publish the transcript, if you're a law nerd, forgive the expression, but it's important. But if you're not, reading transcript can be kind of boring, although some of the transcripts that you hear read from on MSNBC at night from the Daily News can be interesting. But in any event, so what I decided to do was reconstruct the closing arguments. I broke the transcript into 12 parts, had introductions to each part. It was heavily annotated, so if somebody was testifying, there was a footnote as to who that person was and what have you. There was a lot of truth in the transcript, but there was also a lot of falsehood, and there was a lot that was missing. So I was able to, put all of that together. There was a long prologue, the 12 introductions to each of the parts, and then a long epilogue. And so I thought, this is something that's really important to have out there. And I thought, God, I'm so excited about this. It's before depression set in.
Well, you were excited. No one else has written a book of this depth. Countless hours. I mean, really, you could almost say you started this book when you wrote your editorial in the 1990s. I mean, little did you know that it would swell to a project of this size. But then what happened? You are a lauded author, and then you thought, all right, time to find a publisher.
Yeah, good luck with that. It was the most important book I ever wrote, and yet the most difficult to publish. And it came this close to just dying. And I say this without exaggeration. Susan has been so incredibly supportive. When you put in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, and you see things that are really important that have never been reported at all about something as famous as the Emmett Till trial, and you're so excited, and you go to publisher after publisher and agent after agent, and the response is the same: trial transcripts don't sell. And I'm screaming, I'm saying, but this is not just another trial transcript. I mean, this is a really important document that just for historical purposes deserves to be out there. And besides, it's a lot more. It's annotated, there's all sorts of commentary, there's introductions, there's explanations. This is not like everything else that's been out there. Trial transcripts don't sell, and it was just one nightmare after another. And I'd been warned by Deborah Grosvenor, a known literary agent who's a good friend of mine, that this would be a problem. There were other problems, but that was certainly a big one. And it came really close to dying. Then there's a friend of mine who publishes law books, probably one of the top law book publishers in the country, and primarily for law schools. And so I went to him, and he said, it would be an honor to publish this. I will say this, if you buy the book, $25, but if you buy the book and you read nothing but the foreword by Congressman Bobby Rush and the introduction by the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch, and hopefully the prologue that I wrote, if you read nothing else, it's worth it for that. And that incredible prologue, foreword, I should say, by Congressman Bobby Rush, now retired civil rights activist, the lead author of in the House, that is, of the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. When I saw it, I fell to the floor. It's incredible. Who made that possible? Jamie Raskin. Jamie Raskin, seeing the manuscript early on, he was so unbelievably supportive. And that was a big thing. Of course, that happened very late in the process, so. And then there's an incredible introduction, really, 12 pages or so by the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch. And that wouldn't have happened but for a woman who lives across the street at the Adagio with us, Betsy Griffith, and who herself is a rather known author, and Ann Compton, who covered the White House for ABC. And so Betsy said to me, Lonnie Bunch has got to see this book, and get him to write an introduction. I said, yeah, Barack Obama has to see it too. It's like, how am I going to get to Lonnie Bunch? And it turned out that Ann Compton was going to be interviewing him, and so Betsy said to me, just write a 2-page or 3-page overview, put it in an envelope. We're good friends. We've known him for years, and when I nod my head, you hand him the envelope, right? And so I did, and he gave me his card and said, just send me the manuscript. I look forward to see it. If you lived in Washington, D.C. long enough, you can be skeptical when somebody in public says something like that. So time went by, I hadn't heard from him. I thought he's a busy man, and so I get a call. And anyway, I'm just about to finish this, but the secretary said he'd like to do a Zoom interview with me, and so we're on the phone, doing the Zoom interview, I should say, and a couple of minutes into it, he says to me, I consider this book to be a historic moment. And I said to him, if you don't see my face on the screen in 5 seconds, it's because I just passed out. So, I think of it, is this book being reviewed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, what have you? No. Is it going to be a bestseller? No. But, as Susan's reminded me, the introduction, the foreword, and the fact that it's out there, to me, is extremely important. And I can't begin to tell you how well it's been received in the civil rights community. Some very prominent civil rights people. I'm going to New York next month to talk to the head of the NACP Legal Defense Fund about the Till book and also about my next book. So, from that vantage point, it's worth it, and I go ahead.
Well, you had an extraordinary conversation in Politics and Prose with
Jason Downs.
Jason Downs.
Yeah.
This book has caught the attention of the people who are up to their necks in addressing the huge gaps and misrepresentations. So, Ron, you have caught their attention.
Yeah, if you asked me, if you said, and this is a question for writers to think about, if somebody said to you, look, you can write a 270-page narrative of the trial, high octane, whatever, screw the transcript, just do a high, if you do that, publish it, you might not get a big advance or anything, but you can publish it with a trade publisher, probably get reviewed, whatever. Or would you just want to publish this transcript with commentary that's a historic moment, but no big trade house is going to take it, and the New York Times, the Washington Post aren't going to review it, and most bookstores won't carry it. Which one do you pick? I think I picked the right one, but I can understand why a lot of people, and if you'd asked me a year ago if I'd picked the right one, I would have said I shouldn't have picked, period. But, so, yeah, it just kind of came down to that. But
as someone who's read the annotations and the commentary very closely, I want to place, it's not just the introduction, the Lonnie Bunch statement, the prologue, they are beautiful. But actually, the transcript is riveting. The annotations, to read them, is sort of this surreal moment when I go back to grade school, high school, and the inch of history dedicated in my history books. And it was Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, no mention of this. And what understanding I thought I had, and I think most of us think that we have, is completely blown apart by that labor, the toil that went into the commentary. So, good choice.
Well, all's well that ends well, as the Bard says. So, I'm happy with it. I feel, like I said, when Lonnie Bunch said to me, I consider this book a good historic moment, I agree with it. And Janae Nelson, the head of Legal Defense Fund, we did an event at the National Constitution Center. It's like magical. And so to kind of reach that community, the University of Mississippi Law School is having a whole conference on the book. And that's not just me speaking, but they're doing a whole conference. So and it's in Mississippi. Vassar is doing a whole big program, and so there's a bunch of things that are happening. So it's getting out there.
It definitely is. I mean, Ron is not inclined to read from the book, but I want to, and I do want to read from the foreword, or at least an excerpt by Bobby Rush. He writes, I should say the Reverend Bobby Rush, as well as former Representative Bobby Rush. Professor Collins, through the powerful imagery of the Mississippi racial madness in a small rural town courtroom, has shed an illuminating light on the campaign that ruthlessly tried and almost succeeded to legitimize inhumanity. With skill and vigor, he's done so by examining the lost trial transcript of the two brutish white bastards who murdered Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black-skinned, God-gifted, energetic boy. He goes on to say, like so many others, I thought I knew pretty much all there was to know about the Till Murder Trial and the hasty not guilty verdict by an all-white male jury. Then I read Tragedy on Trial and learned of so many other evils lurking in the transcript. To think that this shocking story might have been lost to time reveals how the story of prejudice must be retold to new generations in truthful and unapologetic ways. Tenacity in the cause of truth is no sin. So, yeah, tenacious, I think, pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, I mean, in most forewords, this is a good book. It belongs on every shelf, whatever. And when you read this, he called me. The publisher waited months and months, first for this, and then many more months for Lonnie Bunch's, Secretary Bunch's introduction. And so he called me up, the congressman, and he has a speech impediment because he has an operation on his tongue, surgery on his tongue. And he said, I'm sorry it took so long, but I'm sending it to you by email tomorrow. And I got it, and I turned to Susan and I said, boy, this one was worth waiting for. I said, this one was worth waiting for, By the way, speaking of that, when I was speaking on the Zoom call with Secretary Bunch, he quoted a jazz musician, I can't remember who it was, and I said, do you mind if I respond in kind? And I'm already 20 minutes on the phone with him, phone, Zoom. And 20 minutes of this man's time is a long time. Really a long time. So I said, after he quotes this jazz musician, I said, do you mind if I respond in kind? And he said, oh, of course. I said, it's been a long time coming, but a change is going to come. And he goes, Sam Cooke. He said, my family loves Sam Cooke. And he says, what are your favorite two Sam Cooke songs? And now his secretary's beeping and telling him he's got to go. And I said, well, it wouldn't be Cupid. He said, no, Cupid's a nice song, but no. I said, well, one of them have to be Chain Gang. He goes, oh, my father loved Chain Gang. He said, do you know the story about Chain Gang? So we were talking. He said, so what's your other one? And I said, well, it was never popular. I said, it was a gospel song, Touch the Hem of His Garment. He goes, my God, my mother loved that song. And we sang that in church, and now his secretary's beeping and saying, you gotta go. And so he said, any more music? And I said, well, you know the story about Jimmy Mack? He said, by Martha Vandellas? I go, yeah. He goes, this is the secretary of the Smithsonian. I've never spoken to the man before, at all. Apart from when I was introduced to him. And he goes, there's a story about Jimmy Mack? I go, yeah. And now his secretary says, you've got to go. So I said, well, the next time I see you, I'll tell you. So it was kind of one of those, I can't tell you, the man was so knowledgeable. And the same thing with Jamie Raskin. So knowledgeable and yet so giving and so as I said, but for Jamie Raskin, the Bobby Rush thing wouldn't have happened, but for Ann Compton and Betsy Griffin, Lonnie Bunch's thing. And so for me, forgive me for taking a little more time, but people like that just, they're just not like that. I mean, Jamie Raskin and Lonnie Bunch are just two special people, and I'm so honored that they, lent their names to this project.
I mean, you're highlighting their generosity. I certainly see it whenever I'm with Ron. He's always using the occasion to bring other people in the room to the spotlight. But I do, this is jumping ahead to a question I had, but I'll talk about it now, which is your relationship with music. I mean, you have an encyclopedic knowledge of music, and I think anybody in this room who actually, and I see people laughing and nodding their heads, I mean, you really can't have a discussion with Ron about anything else without music coming into it. And I just want to say, how does that sort of, I almost feel like you're living one, track of your life on music. How does that inform your writing? Read any of your books, your calling in musical references, but what gives with that? I mean, it's so powerful. I really don't know anybody else who has these two passions that are so closely fused.
Well,
and what's that like, Susan? I mean, that must be.
I was listening just about an hour and a half ago to Eminem, Lose Yourself. He says, if you have just one shot, one opportunity, would you take it or would you let it slip? And it's just such a work of fiction I'm working on, the opening scene is somebody listening to Eminem, because that song, Lose Yourself, wow, but I was just saying to somebody the other day, I can remember when I was 12, we were at a Hody's, I think it's a drive-in restaurant in Southern California. And I was sitting in the back seat with my parents, and I thought, God, it's so cool to eat food in the car and you have, the server come, and she wasn't on roller skates, but they did come in. And I'm sitting, and my parents are playing Bobby Darin, Dream Lover. And I thought, God, that's such an incredible song, And so I've always been moved. I grew up on Bob Dylan, The Lonesome Death of Haiti Carroll. I recently discovered Shabuzi, a bar song. If you haven't heard that, it's an incredible song.
That's sidetracked. Oh, okay, and I think
but music has always been. There's a great song called Mississippi Goddamn. If you haven't heard that. Nina Simone, thank you. Really powerful, and it's been inspired in part by the Emmett Till murder, but just incredibly. But anyway, I mean, if I had the talent, I would definitely be a musician, but I don't have the talent.
So you make up for it in other ways. You reference in your prologue the psychology of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a book that goes into that very deeply. In a way that...
Can I ask you both to speak up?
Oh, sure.
It's hard back here.
So sorry. Thank you. I'm just talking about Ron's reference to the psychology of evil in his book. And I'm wondering, how does this affect you, writing this book, living with it for so long? One can't remain oblivious to that. How did you notice yourself changing? How did it influence how you managed your research in the material? Say more about that psychology of evil.
Well, yeah, it'll give me an opportunity to also tell a little bit about the Emmett Till story. I just want to say, when I was young, much younger, and I heard The Lonesome Death of Haiti Carroll by Bob Dylan, an incredibly powerful song. What really bugged me out is that some of it isn't true. But it's still powerful, because I did all this research on it. It took place in Baltimore, but there's enough in it that's true. But it's such an incredibly powerful song. The same thing. So it's August of 1955. Young Emmett Till from Chicago decides he's going to spend some time with his cousins in Mississippi. He's really looking forward to it. His mother warns him that things are different in Mississippi, and she gives him a talk about how he should behave, particularly around white people. But he stays with his great uncle, goes with his cousins. They go to a small, while they're there at the end of the day, they go to a small market, Bryant's meat and grocery market. And he whistles at a white woman. There's no doubt at all that he whistled. And his cousins realize immediately that this is extremely dangerous. They didn't tell his uncle. Uncle Mo's right. Because had they told him, he would have moved Emmett Till out of there immediately. Anyway, Carolyn Bryant, her husband, and her brother-in-law, men with vicious racists with vicious tempers, they come, they kidnap Emmett, they murder him, brutal murder, and she comes, Mamie Till comes to claim the body in Mississippi, which was, the body had been sealed by the sheriff in order to be buried immediately. And in order to get the body, she had to sign a statement that under no circumstances would the coffin be opened. She takes it to Chicago, and I'm leaving out a lot, but she has an open casket funeral, tens of thousands of people, largely African Americans. Can you believe this? And there's video of it but women bring 10-year-old kids to look, and when you looked at the face of Emmett Till, it was ghastly. And, it occurred to me that, we talk about Brown v. Board and Rosa Parks. Really, the launch of the civil rights movement in some kind of meaningful way is that open casket funeral. That just opened, it went international. There had been 500 blacks that had been lynched in Mississippi prior to this, and nobody remembered them, So it was the bravery of Mamie Till Bradley, later Mobley, to have that open casket. It went international. The other thing that was really important was the Jet magazine published photographs. Jet magazine was largely an entertainment sports magazine, but they published close-up photos of Emmett Till. And one of the things I noticed in writing this book, every African American I spoke to who was over 50, and I told them about it, was doing a book on Emmett Till. Every one of them, not most of them, not many of them, every one of them mentioned Jet magazine. And that sold 400,000 copies. So it was one of those moments. It was this kind of catalytic moment. And even though I'm a law professor and have written about trials, you can't write about something like that and be detached. I'd never be good in an ER room, right? I just pass out immediately, But when you're that close and you're writing about this stuff, you can't just, kind of separate yourself from it. So there are some places where I talk about, like, the psychology of evil. Simone Weil, a noted philosopher and French activist who died in 1943, said, there are certain evils that once they're put in motion, it takes decades or even centuries to undo. And I think, the Emmett Till is an example of that, because when I was writing about this, I learned that there were certain lies, falsehoods that had perpetuated to this day. They needed to be corrected. So, it was at times a tough book to write, because you get close up there, and there was so much evil. I mean, I could write a whole book just on the sheriff. He was so bad. And by the way, most people saw, the way the Till trial had been covered mostly is an all-white male jury. It took them 67 minutes. They had a soda break. They laughed during it, and they found the defendants not guilty of murder. Because the fact is that the sheriff had done so much. He testified for the defense. Jason Downs, a noted, criminal defense lawyer, when he interviewed me at Politics and Prose, said, "I've never heard of a sheriff testifying for the defense." So anyway, that was part of what went into it. And, it was, at times it was just hard, because you're writing about this stuff and you're visualizing it, and it's hard to do.
I am really struck by the hold that this book has had on you, starting with the editorial. Is that 30 years ago? Some 30 years ago, the civil rights tour, being in the courtroom, that choice that you made, I mean, having all those doors slammed in your face. Do you write the book that will, be more commercially successful, appealing? Do you write this book that you ended up writing? And now you're teaching. You've offered 3 classes in Emmett Till at the Lewis Public Library. Next one starting July 9th, 2 days a week for 3 weeks.
Yeah, it's hybrid.
This is a book that's not letting go of you.
So yeah, I will be teaching. I did one for Ollie. I taught several classes on Emmett Till. They've asked me to do it again when I get the time. But the one I'm doing for the Lewis Public Library that begins the first Tuesday in July, it's hybrid, so you can sign up. But we meet Tuesday and Thursdays for 90 minutes, and we'll go through the whole book. This will be the 4th time I've taught it, so I'm kind of looking forward to that. Now that I don't have to grade exams and law students and what have you, so I can kind of do what I want.
So the book still has its hold on you, but in the meantime, you have more projects in the hopper.
I do.
And not all of them are legal in nature.
Well,
You've been writing short stories.
none of them are illegal.
Yeah, okay. But you've got, for about as long as I've known you, I've known that you have short stories, some of which I've gotten to see, and I'm like, come on, Ron, hurry up and finish these. And yet you've already got the next book on, what is it, Brown versus
Board.
Yeah, in Delaware. So, I mean, how are you going to, as a writer, and anybody who's a writer in the room, we know what it's like to have these competing, desires that where do we put our focus? How do we organize our day? I remember I once asked you about something like, how do you organize yourself? And you simply looked at me and you said, I put in my hours. I put in my hours. I mean, when you wake up in the morning, how do you decide where those hours are going to go?
In July, I will turn 75, and what scares me most is I'll wake up one morning and won't have an idea for the next book. By the way, he's too humble to note it, but I mean, David Stewart has not only been a phenomenal author of nonfiction, but he's fiction as well. So, I want you to know I'm trying to rival you and do my best. How successful I'll be, I don't know, but I imagine that Susan's afraid that, I'll walk in another courtroom one day and have another idea. The next book is a nonfiction book. It's on Brown v. Board. I thought, well, God, what's there new to be written about Brown v. Board? I mean, Richard Kluger, Simple Justice. And about a year and a half ago, I was someplace in Delaware where we have a home as well, and somebody says, as they said in the, it was written by Judge Colin Sykes in the Delaware case in Brown v. Board. I go, the Delaware case? What are we talking about? Because I taught Brown v. Board, I don't know how many times. Well, when Brown v. Board went to the United States with the desegregation decision in 1954, when it went to the Supreme Court, there were, in addition to the case from Topeka, there were other cases from other states that were consolidated with it. And one of them was Delaware. And the Delaware story, unbelievable. And it gets 18 pages in Richard Kluger's book, Simple Justice, but the story has been it's incredible. So I didn't plan to write that book, and last week we've been holding programs, events in Delaware, and I've been talking to, I don't know, Dave, do you know Virginia Seitz? She's a prominent lawyer that does sports law, the daughter. But anyway, it's an incredible story, so I'm working on that. But there are 3 works of fiction that I've been working on since 2004. So 2 novels and a collection of short stories. The novels are Forbidden Freedom, which is about 90% done. I Take My Chances, which is a collection of 20 short stories, and 18 of them are done. And then Mother's Day, about a guy accused of murdering his mother on Mother's Day, which is a Patricia Highsmith kind of type of novel. And that's about half done. So if all goes well, by December, I hope to have the short stories and Forbidden Freedom, the novel, done. Mother's Day will take another year. And the Brown v. Board book will probably be a year. So it's, at times I feel like I'm not quite sure where my mind is. We were just talking about this.
Clearly.
Yeah, but that's it. So yes, I mean, it's like today I'm talking about the Emmett Till book. Last week I was talking to audiences in Delaware about, I said, you can't believe this Delaware story, because I'm still learning about it, and so I was talking about that. And then tomorrow I am meeting with Paul Smith, a noted lawyer who's going to play a major role in the book. I'm writing Forbidden Freedom about a lawyer who's about to argue a landmark gay rights case in the Supreme Court. But the short stories, I take my chances every chance I get to. Does anybody know where that phrase comes from? Have you ever heard a song? Anybody? She's from Maryland.
Carpenter wouldn't be.
Mary Chapin Carpenter, yeah. So I heard this Mary Chapin Carpenter.
There's the music again.
I heard this Mary Chapin Carpenter. I take my chances every chance I get. I go, wow, wow. I love that. I love that. And so that inspired a collection of 20 short stories. 16, I guess, had been done between 2004 and 2010. And then some more recently. So, and I'm really excited about part of the short stories. By the way, the short stories and the collection of and the two novels. There's characters that appear in all three. And at the end of the short stories, there's a party called "Come On Up to the House," which is titled from a Tom Waits song, and where all the characters meet at a party. The characters who are in the novel and the characters who are in the short story, and they all meet at a party. In all of this, I created something called fictional realism. So historical fiction, right, is just history with a fictional bent. Fictional realism is the same thing, but it's contemporary. So there's a scene, and this is where I'm looking to Paul Smith to help, and so far he's expressed interest. We'll see what he tells me tomorrow. I'm on pins and needles. There's a scene where the case that's going to the Supreme Court is now an attempt to overrule Obergefell, the gay marriage case. So there's going to be oral arguments in the court. And originally, I was decided that was going to have fictional justices, and now I've decided I want to actually use the real names of the real justices based on what we know of their views on law. There's going to be a note that says that though this is based on what we think would be their views, the actual arguments are created. And it's part of what I call fictional realism. So fictional realism, there's an element of reality that runs through all of the short stories, that runs through all of the novels. And so when I just the other day, I thought, why am I just having these justices' phony names? And I'll have Charles Smith, and everybody knows that that's John Roberts. Screw that. Let's just get in their face. And since I'm not going to be arguing before the court, and I'm not teaching anymore, why not just do it? So I'm kind of excited. So anyway, there's a collection of the short stories, and then Mother's Day. I was enormously influenced by Patricia Highsmith. Talk about a very sick, perverted. By the way, I forgot, and Zach. There are 6 poems in I Take My Chances. They appear in the middle of the book and at the end. And so, yes, the poems that had been
Poems
by me. So yeah. Anyway, Mother's Day. So just to tell you how I was influenced by Patricia Highsmith, I read The Price of Salt, which was then made into a movie, and I was like,
now
wow.
called Carol.
Right. And I thought, wow. And then I read Strangers on the Train and The Talented Mr. Ripley. And at that time, Norton had gotten the rights to all the Patricia Highsmith novels, and Bob Weil, the senior editor there, who's now the editor of Libride, I knew, and I was telling him how fascinated I was, and he sent me the box set of all the Patricia Highsmith. And so I read through it, and she's like a pretty fucked up woman. I mean, I'm a great writer, but a pretty sick mind. My kind of person. And so, but anyway, just a little tease about Mother's Day. Mother's Day, I don't want to have a Hallmark card with blood dripping from, but it's by a guy who attempts to murder his mother on Mother's Day, and he doesn't succeed. She goes into a coma, but she's in a coma for several months, and he's prosecuted for attempted murder and is convicted. Months go by. I'm leaving out a lot, but a reporter gets to know the mother, and over a period of months, they come to realize who the person was that attempted to murder her, and it wasn't the person, Carl Morgan, it wasn't him. And so he's pardoned by the governor. The prosecutor who prosecuted him actually goes to the governor and leads the movement to pardon him, and then we find out at the end who it was. She tried to kill herself and frame her son for murder. And so, a therapist I know gave me a book about these types of mothers. So that actually, I read the book, and that's part of where the idea came from. So the closing scene of Mother's Day is the prosecutor, and he's kind of bummed out. And his wife says, well, what's bothering you? He says, this whole case is just, I prosecuted an innocent man. And she says, well, all's well that ends well. He was pardoned. He said, yeah, but that's not the end of the story. She says, why not? He says, because there's a big problem. She says, what could be the problem? He says, well, the mother attempted to frame her son for murder, right? Had she succeeded, he could have been convicted of murder and gotten the death penalty. And she goes, well, but that didn't happen. He said, but wouldn't she then be guilty of attempted murder? And I've talked to some criminal law professors. They said it's a bit of a stretch, but we could do it. So I'm trying to decide at the end of that whether or not he's actually going to prosecute her or not, or just we leave it. So anyway, that's forbidden freedom, and then the short story.
So one of these days, Ron, they're going to do a cognitive study. They're going to put electrodes on your brain when you're listening to your favorite soundtrack and you're switching genres. And I want to see what those needles do when they try to capture that process. I'm sure some of you have questions for Ron about Tragedy on Trial, or
The forthcoming books.
or the forthcoming books, or what these hours, how he makes that work. Yes, hi.
Hi. In this country, lots of black men were registered, mutilated, or castrated, in lots of trials before all white juries. They were acquitted, and the one that comes to mind is Isaac Woodard. And since you're writing a book on Brown, you know how important that case was. You know how it led to Brown. I don't know that the transcript exists for that trial, or for Leo Frank, or for any of the other people. Why? Well, maybe your answer is we do need transcripts from all these trials.
Yeah.
But why this one?
Well, I had done a book called The Trials of Lenny Bruce, and so a lot of people had written about Bruce, but nobody had written about his prosecutions in 4 different jurisdictions. So, and actually, I was able to get one of the transcripts that had never surfaced. But that was written as a narrative, but all true. And I'd also written about the prosecution of Lawrence Ferlinghetti for selling Howell. So I'd already done 2 books on trials. I mean, some of the ones you just mentioned would be, good examples. To be honest, I better stay away from trials anymore. But I'm a retired law professor. I'm taught it, so this is just kind of natural.
Why this one?
Because it was a portion of the Emmett Till story that really had not been told at any length. And I'm not going to go into it, but the two men who, when they were first arrested, were charged with kidnapping, and they confessed to kidnapping, but they were never prosecuted for kidnapping, only murder, and that's because of the sheriff. But that is pretty significant. And there is something that happened after the trial when a reporter, a freelance reporter, struck a deal with the defense lawyers and the defendants to do their story, and he got them to, quote, confess to the murder. They could do that because of double jeopardy. But when he was writing the story, he had to navigate around kidnapping because they hadn't been charged with kidnapping. Anyway, that Look magazine, he sold it to Look magazine. Look magazine sold 6 million copies in 1956, and then syndicated another 5 million. So in 1956 alone, that story by William Bradford Huey sold 11 million copies. Fast forward, Juan Williams writes a book, and it relies heavily on William Bradford Huey. Eyes on the Prize opens with, William Bradford Huey talking about the events. The problem with it is that half of what was in that Look magazine story was false. And I document that based on FBI reports and other research that I had done. And so there was, the other thing I wanted to correct was the William Bradford Huey. I'm going to give you one example. And this is, by the way, in his papers at Ohio State, so I was able to document it. So at one point, he says, well, so how did you get Emmett from point A to point B? He can't say that because that's kidnapping. So that has to be erased. Well, who helped you load the body on the truck? Can't do that because those people could be criminally prosecuted. Well, did it happen at Milam's brother's farm? Yeah, it happened there. That's where I was born. Can't mention that because the brother could be prosecuted. And the way that Bradford Huey has it in the Look magazine story is that they're on the Tallahatchie Bridge. They have a gun pointed to Emmett's, and they give him one last chance to kind of apologize. And he smart talks them, and they shoot him in the head. He was long dead before that. They had already brutally murdered him, and it never happened. And yet, this story, to this day, I mean, Juan Williams, when he wrote it, had no idea. I counted at least 12 major lies. So that was part of what I wanted to correct. And I was, actually there's two parts of the book. One was getting the transcript out there and commenting on it. The other was correcting the William Bradford Huey thing. And so that was very, very exciting.
To your point, if I could just say, yes, there's so much more about these horrific cases that we need to know. We need to know. I think, Ron, what your book really captures is how the mind-boggling courage of Emmett's mother, Mamie, in transferring the coffin, opening it, and then displaying the body of her son, launched the modern civil rights movement. And I think that is a key distinction, but there are more books to be written, and we need to be here in this room, and elsewhere when they come out. There was another question. Yeah.
It's a while since I've read a trial transcript, but I used to have to read them. And they can be pretty sludgy going. The question isn't terribly clear, and the witness clearly misunderstands it, and they go back and forth and chase the rabbit around the room, and you get an objection, and everybody gets derailed, and he can't find his way back. Did you have to trim some of that stuff? And
The truth, the whole truth, everything. Because it occurred to me, I mean, there was a page and a half missing, and I found the guy who had the page and a half. He wouldn't release it to me. I mean, I don't think it was anything significant as far as I can tell. But one of the reasons, so I said, and you raised a good question, David. I mean, because some of this stuff is for law nerds, for lawyers, we just read the transcript and what have you. And that's why I thought I had to break it up into 12 parts and write introductions and point out what was important, and what was said and what was left unsaid and what was false, to kind of help the reader. So at times the eyes will kind of, glaze over something because there's just some stuff. Carolyn Bryant testifies, but her testimony was excluded from the record. It was highly prejudicial because basically, just to show you, Carolyn Bryant, the woman who was whistled at, the lawyers for the defense actually have her stand up while she's testifying. They walk over, he puts their hand on the waist and says, "Isn't this where the boy put," and by the way, they never refer to any of the African Americans by their surnames. They always refer them by nicknames or first name. But anyway, the defense lawyer puts his hand on her waist and says, "Isn't this where he touched you?" And show us. Of course, none of that happened. It was highly prejudicial. And the Judge Swango, who for a judge in Mississippi in 1955 was incredible. I notice I say in Mississippi in 1955. This is incredibly objective. And so that part of it I wanted to talk about as well. But but the thing is that this is the most extensive document from the time about what happened. And so I thought, it deserved to be out there in its entirety. I could have written a narrative and just picked, because people had done that. So it's all there, the good, the bad, and the boring. Yes?
Can you tell us, maybe it's a spoiler, what was her testimony in the trial?
Yeah, Carol Bryant is, by the way, a fascinating woman.
I know she recanted later. But I don't really know what
you have to put recanted in quotes. So she's 21 at the time, has 2 children, has a husband who's a vicious racist and a brother-in-law who is a homicidal racist. I mean, men with really violent tempers. And she did not she did not tell her husband, who had been away in Louisiana, and when he came back, she didn't tell him that Emmett whistled. She knew better than that. Was this woman, did she have a lot of problems? Was she a racist? Yes, but if truth be known, she wasn't the one that ratted on Emmett. It was a farmhand who probably wanted to score some points with the boss.
Did you get a farm hand? Yeah. A farm hand?
Yeah, an African-American young black guy. And so that's missing from a lot of the stories. But in any event, some people say, well, she could have done the right thing and just, said, if she had testified against her husband and brother-in-law, she would have been dead, within days. And so if you think about it, it's all well and fine after the fact to say, you should have taken a higher road, this and that. But if you were in that situation and you were Carol Bryant
and the mother of 2 young sons,
2 sons, what would you have done? I mean, the defense lawyers had told her all what to say. They created a whole story, a whole scenario, half of which was just false, flat out false. And she tells it. And I think, if you were heroic and willing to give up your life and let your children be motherless, you could have taken that saintly path. I don't think most mortals, where I fault Carolyn Bryant is that decades later, when her husband was dead, her brother-in-law was dead, and she could have told the true story, she didn't. She does an interview with a writer who writes a book on Emmett Till, and he gets her confession that that her husband and brother-in-law had actually murdered Emmett Till, and she kind of goes into all sorts of great detail. The writer who wrote that book, it seems that his tape recorder stopped working at that time. And so he said he just took it down in notes. When you get these kind of revelations and recanting, you know, and you get it on tape, but your tape isn't working, you retape it, right? That's what you do. And so anyway, the story came out, the FBI looked into it, and they said there wasn't sufficient evidence to believe that she had indeed recanted. She writes a memoir that's not supposed to release until 2036 at, I think it's UNC, and somebody leaks the memoir. And in the memoir, she says it's terrible what happens to Emmett, and it should have never happened, but she wanted to go to her death by saying that her husband and brother-in-law didn't do it. And by the way, there were, one of the things the book points out is these two guys didn't do it alone. They had help from others, at least 5 others. So, you know, there was a lot of that story to be told. But, you know, the Carolyn Bryant story is kind of an interesting one because why she felt the need to perpetuate the lie, you know, afterwards. And she planned this to come out in 2036 when everybody would be dead, you know. And I saw, on the one hand, she was a victim of circumstances. On the other hand, I think she was clearly morally culpable, you know.
How about one more? Yes.
The farmhand got 50 cents in credit from the story.
I'm sorry?
The farmhand got 50 cents in credit from the story. That's why he did it. That's why he turned it.
And then the store closed.
Yeah, by the way, it's interesting, you know, it's not PC to say that anymore, that there was a black man that went to the white murderers and, you know, turned in Emmett. The fact is, whatever our color is, we're people. People do all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons, whatever their color is. And so I think that's part of why that portion of the story has been silenced so long. And by the way, one of the people that was really significant in helping me with this book was Deborah Anderson, who's written the definitive book on Emmett Till. University of Mississippi Press published it, and he was of enormous help in blurring the book. And just to show you how he helpful was, he went to his publisher, the University of Mississippi Press, and says, "You've got to publish this book. This is really important." He passed on it. I mean, the University of Mississippi Press, for God's sake, passed on it, and they've done the leading book. And Deborah just called me last week and said, "You know, we're doing a second edition, and I really want to include a lot of stuff from your book in the second edition of the book." I said, "Oh, of course, happy to do it." I said, "Would you just tell your publisher that they passed on my book?" You know, University of Mississippi Press, and I'm going to be speaking at Ole Miss, and I plan to dismiss when I'm there. And we even invite the editor out there. I really want to be the bad boy. Can you believe the University of Mississippi Press had an opportunity and they passed on it? So that's what I'm saying.
Any other questions for Ron? Yes.
Ron, are any of the principal people in this story still living?
His cousin, his cousin who was there with him, just did a book. He's alive. He confirms that, and indeed, Emmett did whistle, because some people, you know, it's just, they said, well, he had a speech impediment. He did have a speech impediment, but he did whistle. And the other thing he points out is that he was on, early on, he had realized that the William Bradford Huey story was just a lie. And the African-American press was onto that early on. And they've been writing about that in their newspapers about how this William Bradford Huey story was just not. But that portion didn't catch on, you know. And, you know, the Look magazine thing. And then I haven't had a chance to talk with Juan Williams, who, by the way, I just found out, if you could believe it, that there's a biography, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author is writing a biography of Thurgood Marshall. And I thought, you know, what's left to be said about Thurgood Marshall? And he's probably saying, well, what's left to be said about Brown v. Board? So, you know, who knows? But before the night just runs and we're getting close to that time, I just want to, Zach, say thank you again. And I hope if the lines align, if the stars align and Fortuna smiles, and these novels and short stories find, including with poems, and congratulations to you. You have a novel coming out as well. But I hope I can come back.
And we want the Writers Center to be here when that happens. I'll just mention, no one has asked me to do this. The Writers Center is in the middle of a campaign. 1 week, Zach, $17,000. You're halfway there. Boy, this is now is a really good time to show our appreciation to the Writers Center. And Ron, I just want to thank you. I mean, there was so much of you that you poured into this book. As I said, this book, this story won't let you go. So think about the hybrid course at the Delaware Public Library starting in July. Lewis Public Library.
LAWES.
Yes. The copies of Tragedy on Trial are for sale, $25. It's riveting reading. Thank you all for coming here tonight. Yes.
If you haven't heard Lana Del Rey's latest album, it's incredible. Also, Florence and the Machine, really too phenomenal. So I just brought enough of the story of my life. Thank you all.
Susan's bringing it up.